I sent $2,000 every month for 3 years, a quiet lifeline tossed into the dark. I asked for nothing but a house still standing. Yet at dinner, my father raised his glass, pointed at my sister, and declared she had saved the family from foreclosure. I did not argue. I just smiled and asked a question that froze the entire room. Then who sent you $72,000? No one was prepared for the ugly truth underneath. My name is Bella Brooks, and I am 34 years old. The painted white lines of Interstate 85 blurred into a continuous, hypnotic streak as I drove from Raleigh to my parents' house in Greenville, South Carolina. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles matched the bone-white hue of the moonlight hitting the dashboard. I was running on fumes, completely depleted by the brutal internal audit season at North Pine Risk Group. For the past 12 weeks, my life had been a suffocating spreadsheet of risk assessments, compliance failures, and corporate fraud. Now, I was driving straight into a different kind of liability. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station just across the state line. The smell of cheap coffee and diesel hit me the moment I opened the car door, immediately twisting my stomach into a tight, nauseous knot. I leaned against the cold metal of my sedan, breathing in the crisp autumn air, trying to keep the physical toll of the stress at bay. It felt like the exhaustion was eating me alive from the inside out. I closed my eyes and whispered my battle plan to the empty parking lot. Just eat one meal, hear one thank you, then go home. It was a simple transaction, a meager return on a massive 3-year investment. By the time my tires crunched onto the familiar gravel driveway in Greenville, the tension in my shoulders had solidified into concrete. But then I looked up through the windshield. The house, which had been peeling and gray the last time I saw it, gleamed under the porch lights with a fresh coat of eggshell paint. The front lawn was cut with geometric precision, the flower beds manicured, the broken shutters newly repaired. A wave of profound, exhausted relief washed over me. I killed the engine and rested my forehead against the steering wheel. My money is helping. The sacrifice was not for nothing. The $2,000 I bled out of my paycheck every single month had kept this roof from collapsing. I grabbed the store-bought pumpkin pie from the passenger seat and walked up the front steps, before I even turned the brass knob. A booming, full-throated laugh vibrated through the solid oak door. It was my father, Frank Brooks. It was a warm, joyous sound I recognized from childhood, but a sound that had not been directed at me in over a decade. I pushed the door open. The entryway smelled of expensive cinnamon candles and roasted turkey. I stepped into the foyer, holding my plastic-wrapped pie, and immediately felt the temperature in the room shift. From the living room, my sister Sienna materialized like a walking advertisement for a lifestyle magazine. She was drenched in a sickeningly sweet, high-end perfume that overpowered the smell of the food. She wore a pristine silk blouse, a salon-perfect blowout, and a heavy, sparkling new gold bracelet that caught the chandelier light with every movement. Right behind her was her fiancé, Derek Voss, looking like a finance bro extra from a bad movie. He was balancing an imported wooden wine box in one hand and a stack of glossy boutique shopping bags in the other. I set my humble, dented pie tin down on the kitchen counter. Looking at Sienna's glittering display, I felt less like a returning daughter and more like a human placeholder, an empty space drafted in merely to fill a chair at the table. Dinner was served on the fine china I had not seen since my grandmother passed. The air in the dining room was thick with a celebratory energy that I could not comprehend. I sat at the far end of the table, quietly cutting my meat, watching the performance unfold. As the main plates were cleared, Frank pushed his chair back and stood up. He tapped his fork against his crystal wine glass, the sharp ringing demanding absolute silence from the room. He cleared his throat, his chest puffing up with patriarchal pride. He raised his glass, but his eyes bypassed me completely. "I want to propose a tribute," my father began, his voice thick with emotion. "This year has been incredibly hard. We all know it. We were standing on the absolute edge. We almost faced foreclosure. We almost lost the home we built our lives in. He paused dramatically, letting the heavy reality of the word foreclosure hang over the table. Then, he smiled warmly, pointing his glass directly at my sister. But Sienna stepped up. She saved us. She saved this family when we had nowhere else to turn. Derek clapped loudly, whistling like he was at a sporting event. My mother clapped softly, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin. Sienna bowed her head, smiling a perfectly practiced, humble smile, batting her eyelashes as if she were streaming this touching moment live to thousands of adoring followers. The sheer audacity of the scene made the blood freeze in my veins. As the applause died down, the warmth in my father's face vanished. He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes hardening into twin stones of absolute disappointment. The shift was so sudden, so sharp, it felt like a physical strike. "And you?" Frank said, his voice dropping into a cold, dismissive register. "You just disappear. You never call. You show up here with a cheap pie and expect a seat at the table while your sister carries the weight of the world." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. They were waiting for me to shatter, to cry, or to apologize for my absence. But my audit-honed brain did not process panic. It processed ledgers. It processed facts. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I picked up my napkin, neatly folded it, and placed it beside my dinner plate. I looked directly into my father's eyes and smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a corporate, calculating smile, and my voice came out as smooth as velvet. "Then who sent you $72,000? The silence that followed my question did not just fill the room. It sucked the oxygen straight out of it. As my father stared at me, his mouth slightly parted in confusion, my mind violently pulled me backward. I was no longer sitting at a table set with fine china. I was transported back to the cramped, fluorescent-lit cubicle where this entire nightmare began exactly 36 months ago. Back then, the phone call from my mother had come on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She was sobbing so hard I could barely decipher her words. My father had just had his factory hours slashed in half. To make matters worse, the introductory period on their adjustable rate mortgage had expired, and the monthly payments had skyrocketed. They were drowning. The bank had sent the first warning letter. They were standing on the absolute edge of losing the only home we had ever known. I did not hesitate. I was their daughter, and I had a steady corporate job. We opened a joint checking account, and I set up an automatic transfer. Every single month, on the first day of the month, $2,000 vanished from my payroll and dropped into that account to cover the mortgage shortfall and the basic utilities. It was a massive bleed on my finances, but I told myself it was a necessary tourniquet. The sacrifices I made were not abstract. They were written into the very fabric of my daily life. I drove a rattling 12-year-old sedan that leaked oil in my apartment parking lot. I watched my colleagues take summer trips to Europe and put down payments on beautiful downtown lofts, while I stayed behind, eating meal-prepped rice and chicken, watching my savings account stagnate. I gave up my 20s and the first half of my 30s. I gave up my financial independence, but every time I felt the sting of missing out, I traded it for a quiet, foundational pride. I was holding up the sky for my family. I was the invisible pillar keeping the roof over their heads. For the first year, my mother, Lydia, played her part perfectly. On the second day of every month, my phone would ring. Her voice would be hushed, as if she were hiding in a closet. She would thank me, her words dripping with maternal guilt. But the conversation always ended with the exact same frantic directive. She would beg me never to discuss the exact amounts with my father. She claimed his pride was too fragile, that knowing his eldest daughter was paying for his life would destroy his manhood. I swallowed the secrecy. I accepted the role of the silent ghost because I thought I was protecting a proud man from humiliation. Meanwhile, my sister Sienna was on a perpetual, incredibly well-funded journey of self-discovery, while I was analyzing risk compliance for 60 hours a week. Sienna was changing careers with the seasons. One spring, she declared herself a freelance event stylist. By autumn, she was a digital content coach. The following year, she launched an online boutique that seemed to sell nothing but overpriced. Imported aesthetic candles. Her fiancé, Derek, was even more elusive. If you asked him what he did for a living, he would call himself a founder. He spoke exclusively in corporate buzzwords. He talked about leveraging networks, scaling growth, and closing angel deals. Yet I never saw a single business card, a tangible product, or a legally registered tax document. Slowly, the cracks in the family narrative began to show. I would be sitting at my desk, eating a sad, cold sandwich, scrolling through social media. My feed would suddenly populate with Sienna's glamorous updates, a photo of her holding a glass of imported champagne at a 5-star downtown restaurant, a carousel of pictures from a weekend getaway to a luxury coastal resort, a casual selfie where a brand-new, premium leather designer bag rested on the passenger seat of her car. All of this was happening while my mother was simultaneously texting me, asking if I could spare an extra $300 to fix a broken water heater because things were just so incredibly tight. I saw the red flags. They were waving furiously in my face, but I forced myself to look away. I ignored the glaring inconsistencies because she was blood. More importantly, I ignored it because I was exhausted. Working relentless corporate audits drains the fight out of you. It is a specific, bone-deep kind of tired that makes a person willingly blind. When you are that exhausted, it is simply easier to believe the comforting lies of your family than to confront the ugly. Mathematical data. Writing the check was easier than starting a war, but sitting here now, at this polished dining table, the exhaustion evaporated. Looking at Sienna's smug, downward cast eyes and the heavy gold bracelet weighing down her wrist, a cold realization washed over me. I was not just being forgotten. I was not just the unappreciated workhorse. My history, my sweat, and my absolute sacrifice were being actively rewritten right in front of my face. My parents were taking the credit that belonged to my bleeding bank account and pasting Sienna's perfectly contoured face right over it. The familial hurt, that desperate childhood need for my father to look at me with pride, died right then and there. It flatlined in its place. The cold, ruthless instinct of a senior internal auditor woke up. I looked at the sudden panic flashing in my mother's eyes and the defensive posture Derek was taking. The math did not add up. The lifestyle did not match the revenue. In my line of work, there is a golden rule. When a story is too perfectly packaged, when the narrative is too flawless and the heroes are too clean, it means someone is hiding the real ledgers, and I was about to rip the floorboards up to find them. The words hung in the air. The silence was thick, heavy, and absolute. I kept my posture perfectly relaxed. I leaned back in my chair. I picked up my water glass. I took a very slow, deliberate sip. I let the cold water slide down my throat while I let them process the math. $72,000. It was a massive number. It was an undeniable, concrete figure sitting squarely in the middle of our dinner plates. "I am just curious," I said lightly. My tone was entirely conversational, stripping away any trace of accusation. Did Sienna pay the mortgage directly to the bank, or did she transfer the funds to Mom? Sienna shifted in her seat. Her perfect, runway-ready posture faltered for a fraction of a second. She reached for her wine glass, but pulled her hand back before touching the stem. "We have multiple revenue streams," Sienna answered. Her voice was breathy and high-pitched. It lacked its usual absolute, unshakable confidence. "Our cash flow is very flexible. We move capital around as needed." "Capital," I repeated. I let the word linger. It was a fascinating choice of vocabulary for a standard residential home loan payment. People who actually pay mortgages do not call it capital. They call it a bill. My father slammed his hand flat on the oak table. The silverware rattled violently against the porcelain plates. The sudden noise made my mother flinch. "Stop interrogating your sister like an auditor," Frank barked. His face was flushing a deep, angry red, the color crawling up from his collar. "She just bought us dinner. She brought gifts. She saved this house. Have some respect in this dining room." I did not look at my father. His anger was loud, but it was useless data. I watched the rest of the table. The micro-expressions were screaming the truth at me. My mother, Lydia, was staring intensely at her lap. Her hands rested flat on her thighs, hidden beneath the tablecloth, but I could see her shoulders vibrating. She was shaking. A fine, rapid tremor shook her entire frame. She refused to look up. She refused to make eye contact with me, with Frank, or with Sienna. She was shrinking into herself, beside Sienna. Derek was acting like a man drowning in dry air. He grabbed his heavy crystal goblet. He drained the dark red wine in 3 massive, desperate gulps. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He poured himself another full glass immediately, the bottle clinking erratically against the rim of the cup. He was drinking like a man terrified of a quiet room. Sienna sensed the rapidly shifting energy. The spotlight was burning her. She decided to go on the offensive. She lifted her chin, adopting a mask of wounded martyrdom. She projected her voice loudly so it bounced off the dining room walls, ensuring Frank heard every single syllable. "I have taken care of everything for 3 years," Sienna declared. She placed a manicured hand gracefully over her heart. "I stepped up when things got incredibly hard. I do not need a parade. I do not need recognition from anyone. I did it because family comes first." I looked at the hand covering her heart. Specifically, I looked at her wrist. The new bracelet she wore was unmistakable. It was a solid gold designer piece, studded with small stones. My brain accessed a luxury retail catalog I had audited months ago. That specific piece retailed for at least $8,000. I moved my eyes to the corner of the room. Derek's boutique shopping bags sat neatly in a row near the entryway. They bore the embossed logos of high-end department stores. The imported wooden wine box resting on the kitchen counter was easily a $500 vintage. My brain crunched the numbers automatically. Cold and efficient, $8,000 for the jewelry, $1,000 for the boutique gifts, $500 for the wine. You do not casually drop nearly $10,000 on a random Tuesday night dinner visit while single-handedly carrying a distressed, high-interest residential mortgage. The math was entirely fraudulent. It was a physical impossibility. "You cannot stand it, can you?" Frank sneered. His voice was laced with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You are just jealous." I finally shifted my gaze to my father. He was glaring at me like I was a stranger who had broken into his home. "You sit up there in your fancy corporate office," Frank continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You get your degree, you make your salary, and you look down on us. You look down on your sister because she does not wear a suit. You think you are better than her, but she has a better heart than you ever will." The insult was perfectly designed to hurt. It was designed to strike my deepest insecurities, to make me cry, to make me grab my coat and storm out of the house in tears. 3 years ago, it would have worked flawlessly. Today, it simply confirmed my hypothesis. He was aggressively defending a lie because the truth was too humiliating to consider. I did not argue. I did not defend my degree, my career, or my heart. I completely dropped the emotional angle. In an audit, emotion is the enemy of truth. "You are right, Dad," I said smoothly. I folded my hands together and rested them on the edge of the table. "I am just an auditor, and auditors do not care about who has the better heart. We care about compliance. I just want to make sure everything is following the correct procedure. Foreclosure is no joke. The bank does not care about family loyalty. They only care about cleared funds." Derek cleared his throat. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table. He tried to puff his chest out, attempting to look physically intimidating to shut down the conversation. "You are way out of line," Derek said. His voice was a forced, aggressive baritone. "We handle our business. We do not need to prove anything to you. If you want proof, anyone can pull up a fake document online. Bank screenshots can be faked in 5 minutes on a laptop." It was the dumbest thing he could have possibly said. It was a massive, catastrophic strategic error. In his panic to build a defense, he handed me the exact weapon I needed to execute the final strike. I looked directly at Derek. I smiled. It was the same cold, dead smile I used during hostile corporate fraud interviews. "You are absolutely right, Derek," I nodded slowly, showing complete agreement. "Digital images can easily be altered. A screenshot is not reliable evidence at all. It is a terrible way to verify a financial transaction." I reached into my leather handbag resting by my feet. I pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen. I placed the device flat on the center of the dining table, right next to the crystal gravy boat, ensuring the screen was visible to everyone. "Therefore, I will not show you a picture," I announced. My voice was calm, perfectly steady, and as sharp as a surgical scalpel. "I will log in live." The biometric scanner on my phone flashed, recognizing my face instantly. A tiny green padlock icon unlocked on the screen, granting me access to the vault of absolute truth. I tapped the blue banking application icon. The interface glowed brightly against the dim yellow lighting of the dining room. I navigated straight to the joint checking account, the specific one I had opened with my mother 36 months ago. I did not rush the process. I let the silence stretch across the table, forcing everyone to sit in the uncomfortable, suffocating air of their own making. I tapped the filter icon and set the transaction history to display the last 3 years. A long, uninterrupted list of green numbers populated the screen. Every single line was identical. I placed my index finger on the smooth glass edge of the phone and pushed it slowly across the polished mahogany table. It slid silently and stopped exactly 1 inch from my father's dinner plate. "Look at the screen," I instructed gently. My tone sounded more like a cold command from a courtroom judge than a request from a daughter. Frank stared at the device as if I had just slid a live explosive into his lap. He hesitated for a long moment before his rough, calloused fingers reached out to pick it up. He held the phone awkwardly, squinting at the glowing ledger. His eyes began to track the lines, down, 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 over and over again. $2,000, the first of the month, $2,000, the first of the month, a perfectly consistent, undeniable rhythm of financial salvation. "Look at the sender name," I said, my voice completely devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "Read it out loud." Frank swallowed hard. His jaw tightened visibly. "Sender name, Bella Brooks." The words sounded incredibly foreign in his mouth, completely destroying the grand, celebratory speech he had delivered just 10 minutes prior. He gripped the phone tighter, the blood draining from his knuckles. He was holding a piece of glass and metal that was actively dismantling the entire foundation of his reality. Sienna let out a sharp, breathless scoff from the other side of the table. She uncrossed her legs and leaned back abruptly, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails dug slightly into the fabric of her expensive silk sleeves. "So what?" Sienna challenged, her voice raising an octave in a sudden spike of defensive panic. "Maybe you are just paying them back for college tuition. You owe them for raising you anyway." It was a pathetic, flailing attempt to regain control of the narrative. I did not even blink. I kept my eyes locked on her, delivering the facts with the lethal precision of an executioner. "I went to the state university on a full academic scholarship," I replied calmly. "I worked night shifts in the campus library to pay for my own books and my own groceries. I never cost this family a single dime in tuition. But let us indulge your desperate theory for a moment. Sienna, let us pretend this was a reimbursement for some imaginary debt." I turned my attention back to my father. "Dad, tap on any of those transactions. Open the detailed view." Frank obeyed numbly. His thick thumb tapped the glass screen. A new page opened, detailing the exact routing numbers and the specific transaction notes attached to the wire. "If this is me paying back a debt," I continued, my tone dropping to a freezing register, "why does the memo line on every single one of those 36 transfers read, 'Mortgage buffer'?" Frank stared at the words, "Mortgage buffer." The letters were small, but they screamed the truth. He looked up, his eyes darting frantically from the phone screen to my face, searching for a glitch, a lie, or anything to make the nightmare stop. I did not give him time to recover. I leaned across the table, invading his physical space. I reached out and dragged my finger across the screen. Swiping over to the Deposits tab, I scrolled down the entire history of the joint checking account. "Look closely at the incoming funds," I instructed, tapping the glass heavily for emphasis. "There is the entire ledger, 3 full years of deposits. Every single cent in that account came straight from my payroll. Scan it, search for her name. You will not find it. There is not a single dollar, not a single penny, deposited by Sienna Brooks." A sharp, ragged gasp broke the silence. It was not Sienna. It was my mother. Lydia collapsed forward, burying her face deeply in her hands. Her shoulders heaved violently. She burst into heavy, uncontrollable tears. It was not the theatrical crying of someone trying to garner sympathy or manipulate the room. It was the devastating, ugly weeping of someone who had been carrying a crushing, toxic secret for years and had finally been forced to drop it. The burden of the lie had been dragged out into the harsh light of day, and the sheer relief of being caught broke her completely. Frank slowly lowered the phone. The device clattered softly against the fine china plate. He did not look at me anymore. He did not look at Sienna, either. He turned his head slowly, his neck stiff, fixing his gaze entirely on his weeping wife. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute and devastating. "Lydia," Frank said. His voice was no longer loud or angry. It was hollowed out, entirely empty, and terrifyingly quiet. "Where is Sienna's money?" Lydia shook her head frantically, her face still buried in her trembling hands. She could not speak. The guilt was actively suffocating her. "I asked you a question," Frank demanded, his voice dropping another ominous octave. "You told me Sienna was covering the mortgage. You told me she was the one keeping us afloat. Where is the money?" Lydia finally lifted her head. Her face was streaked with black mascara, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. She looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit. She cast a desperate, pleading glance at Sienna, hoping for a lifeline, but Sienna just stared blankly at the tablecloth, her jaw clenched tight in self-preservation. "She is building her brand," Lydia stammered, her voice cracking violently under the pressure. The excuse sounded utterly absurd, spoken out loud in front of cold financial data. "You know how hard it is to start a business from scratch. Her sister just needed some motivation. I did not want her to feel like a failure. I just wanted her to feel proud." The entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air turned brittle and sharp. The reality of what had transpired over the last 36 months fully crystallized in my mind. My mother had orchestrated a massive emotional fraud to protect her favorite child. I sat back in my chair, distancing myself from the wreckage. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who had called me on the second day of every month, whispering her grateful, pathetic lies while cashing my blood money. My audit was complete. The final report was ready to be delivered. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the dead, heavy quiet of the dining room. "You took the $2,000 I bled for every single month. You took the money I sent to keep a roof over your heads, and you just slapped a new label on it. You took my lifeline, handed it to my father, and called it Sienna's money." I did not let the heavy, suffocating silence settle. Uncovering the origin of the funds was only the first layer of the audit in my profession. Finding the source of the capital is merely the baseline. Tracing where it actually bleeds out is how you catch the thief. I reached across the table, my fingers brushing past the crystal gravy boat, and pulled my phone back toward me. My thumb hovered over the screen, switching from the deposit ledger to the withdrawal history. I began to scroll. The green numbers of my deposits were immediately swallowed by a sea of red subtractions. "We have established who funded this account," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Now, let us examine where those funds actually went." I pushed the phone back toward my father. He recoiled slightly, as if the device might physically burn him, but his eyes were drawn to the glowing screen. I did not wait for him to read it. I narrated the financial autopsy aloud for the entire room, stripping away every ounce of their dignity with cold, hard data. On the 4th of the month, a Zelle transfer of $800 to an account named Sienna Studio, I read, keeping my tone strictly clinical. On the 9th, an ATM cash withdrawal of $400. 2 days later, a debit card transaction for $650 to a wholesale luxury packaging supplier. Another debit charge for $200 at a high-end cosmetics retailer. And it goes on, month after month. Your mortgage buffer was treating someone to a very comfortable lifestyle. Frank's face lost whatever color it had left. He looked like a man who had just been violently struck in the chest. His eyes darted wildly across the screen, processing the sheer volume of red lines draining the account I had bled to fill. The illusion he had championed was actively disintegrating in his hands. "Why is the mortgage money flowing out of the house?" Frank demanded. His voice was no longer a booming roar. It was a desperate, raspy whisper. He turned to Lydia, his large hands trembling against the edge of the dining table. "Lydia, answer me right now. Why is the money leaving the account?" My mother shrank further into her heavy wooden chair. Her hands twisted her linen napkin into a tight, wrinkled knot. She could not bring herself to look at my father. "It was just an advance," she whispered, her voice cracking painfully. "Derek said they just needed a bridge. He promised they were closing a massive deal in exactly 60 days. He said the return on investment would cover the mortgage for the rest of the year. We were going to put it all back before anyone noticed." I felt a cold, bitter laugh rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. A bridge loan funded by an unknowing third party to a phantom startup. It was textbook fraud, wrapped up in maternal enablement. "Show me the last mortgage statement," I commanded, shifting my gaze from my weeping mother to my father. "I want to see the physical bill from the bank. I want to see the balance right now." Frank blinked rapidly, looking entirely disoriented. "We do not get them in the mail anymore. Your mother set up the online portal. She told me it is all paperless now, to save on the postage fees." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a deafening, catastrophic click. Paperless. It was the perfect, invisible curtain. In the modern banking era, going paperless is not just about saving trees. It is the absolute easiest way to ensure the bright red envelopes stamped with urgent warnings and final notices never land in the physical mailbox for a spouse to find. Someone had pulled that digital curtain completely shut, ensuring Frank lived in blissful ignorance while the house burned down around him. Across the table, Sienna's posture shifted entirely. The tearful, misunderstood artist facade vanished in an instant. She sat up bone straight, her shoulders squared, her jaw set in a hard, defiant line. The sweet, breathy tone she used to manipulate my parents was gone, replaced by a sharp, metallic edge that revealed who she truly was. "It is family money," Sienna snapped, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Family is supposed to support each other. You have a great corporate job. You do not even have a mortgage of your own. What does it matter who uses the funds if it stays within the family ecosystem? We are all pulling from the same pot." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her entitlement. She had entirely convinced herself that my 60-hour work weeks, my aging car, and my canceled life plans were simply a communal resource for her boutique aesthetics. "Family money is not money to gamble with," I stated clearly, dropping the words like anvils onto the polished wood table. "And it certainly is not a venture capital fund for a vanity project that generates zero revenue." Derek finally broke his paralyzed silence. He tried to inject a tone of masculine authority into the room, puffing his chest out and resting his forearms heavily on the mahogany surface, trying to physically dominate the space. "You are entirely overreacting, Bella," Derek said, attempting to sound like a seasoned executive managing a hysterical employee. "These are standard marketing expenses. You have to spend capital to scale an enterprise. You clearly do not understand how modern brand building works. We were running targeted campaigns. It is the cost of doing business in today's market." I did not raise my voice. I did not argue about marketing metrics, conversion rates, or return on ad spend. I simply tilted my head, maintained unbreakable eye contact with Derek, and asked the one logical question that destroys every fraudulent pitch. If the marketing is so incredibly effective, I asked calmly, why is the mortgage still late? The effect on the room was instantaneous and devastating. Derek's jaw snapped shut, his teeth clicking audibly. Sienna's defiant glare faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. But the most significant reaction came from my mother. Lydia gasped sharply, a terrible, ragged sound, and her quiet weeping stopped dead. She froze completely, her wide, terrified eyes locked onto me. She had been perfectly willing to redirect my money to fund Sienna's lifestyle, operating under the naive, desperate assumption that the house was somehow still protected. In that singular, crystal-clear moment, looking at the absolute silence radiating from Derek and Sienna, Lydia realized she did not actually know if the bank was being paid at all. The imaginary safety net she thought she was expertly manipulating had completely vanished, leaving nothing but a massive, terrifying drop beneath them. The sudden, paralyzed terror emanating from my mother was all the confirmation I needed that the financial rot went far deeper than stolen allowances. If Lydia did not know the actual status of the loan, then no one in this room was navigating reality except the bank. And banks do not deal in hope. They deal in ledgers. I opened a new tab on my phone browser. I typed in the web address for the national mortgage servicer that held the deed to my parents' house. 3 years ago, when the first wave of financial panic hit this family, I was the one who sat at this very table and helped them navigate the initial loan modification. I had created the administrative login. I still had the master credentials permanently burned into my memory. I typed my father's email address. I typed the password. I hit enter. The portal took exactly 4 seconds to authenticate the connection. In those 4 seconds, the dining room was so quiet, I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, the dashboard materialized on the glowing screen. Standard banking interfaces are designed to be calming, utilizing soft blues and neutral grays. But when an account crosses the threshold of severe default, the architecture of the website changes entirely. The screen was dominated by a massive, glaring crimson banner stretched across the very top. Inside that red box, bold white letters delivered a catastrophic verdict. Delinquent, pre-foreclosure proceedings initiated. I did not say a word. I simply rotated the device and pushed it toward the center of the table. Frank leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process the aggressive warning dominating his account. He read the red banner once. He read it a second time. The confusion on his face slowly morphed into absolute, unadulterated horror. He scanned the numbers displayed prominently beneath the warning. The total amount required to reinstate the loan and stop the legal proceedings was not a minor oversight. It was not a late fee of $50. The screen demanded $14,820, payable immediately. "This is a mistake," Frank stammered, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming authority. He pointed a trembling finger at the glowing numbers. "This is a computer error. It has to be. Sienna told me she paid a lump sum in August. She told me we were paid ahead for the next 6 months." He turned his desperate, terrified gaze toward his youngest daughter. He was begging her to validate the illusion, pleading for her to produce a piece of paper or a confirmation number that would make the red banner disappear. Sienna swallowed hard. The thick coat of defiance she had worn just moments ago completely shattered. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a classic defensive posture, and began scrambling for a new script. "The funds are secure," Sienna rushed out, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic cadence. "The lump sum is absolutely there. It is just temporarily tied up. We moved the capital into a short-term, high-yield investment vehicle to maximize the return before clearing the principal. It is a standard wealth management strategy. The liquidity is just restricted for another 30 days. It was a spectacular display of financial word salad, completely meaningless to anyone who actually understood how secured debt functioned. I did not roll my eyes. I did not use sarcasm or raise my voice to match her rising panic. I kept my posture relaxed, maintaining the clinical detachment of a lead investigator. "Okay," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "Let us assume your high-yield vehicle is real. Let us assume the capital is just restricted. But the bank is threatening to take this house in a matter of weeks. So, I will ask you a very simple, practical question. Can you log into your personal accounts right now, tonight, and pay the minimum past due balance to get this account out of the red?" I waited. I watched Sienna. I watched Derek. Sienna pressed her lips together so tightly they turned white. She looked down at her untouched dinner plate. She did not say a word. Beside her, Derek suddenly found the intricate pattern of the hardwood floor entirely fascinating. He refused to look up. He refused to defend the imaginary investment vehicle. The answer was not hidden in a bank statement or a corporate portfolio. The absolute truth was written perfectly in their suffocating, paralyzed silence. They had absolutely nothing. I pulled the phone back toward me. The silence was damning, but I needed the complete mechanical breakdown of their failure. I tapped the menu icon and navigated to the payment history ledger. I needed to see exactly how they had kept the bank at bay long enough to avoid an immediate eviction notice. The ledger loaded, revealing a timeline of pure financial chaos. There were massive gaps where no payments were made for 90 days at a time, but what caught my auditor's eye were the specific transactions flagged in yellow. I counted them aloud for the room. May 12th, returned payment, I read, pointing at the screen. July 18th, returned payment. September 4th, returned payment. I looked up at Frank. He was staring at me, his face ash gray. "Do you know what a returned payment means on a mortgage portal, Dad?" I asked quietly. "It means someone logged into this system and authorized an electronic draft from a checking account. It makes the account look current for exactly 48 hours. But then, when the mortgage lender actually tries to pull the funds, the source account is completely empty. The payment bounces. The bank hits you with a non-sufficient funds penalty, and your delinquency status accelerates. Someone was deliberately passing bad digital checks to buy themselves another month of pretending to be rich." Frank lifted his hands from the table. They were shaking. The tremor started in his fingers and vibrated violently up his forearms. He looked around his pristine, freshly painted dining room, realizing that the walls he thought were secure were actually resting on a foundation of bounced checks and systematic deception. He had spent 3 years living inside a fabricated story, punishing the daughter who was saving him while praising the daughter who was actively forging the documents of his ruin. A sharp, breathless gasp tore through the room. Lydia clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white. She was hyperventilating. For years, she had justified her theft by telling herself she was merely redistributing surplus wealth. She had rationalized the deceit, convinced that her youngest daughter just needed a little more time to succeed. But staring at the reality of the returned payments, Lydia realized the terrifying truth. She had not just covered up a minor indiscretion by funding Sienna's vanity projects and keeping Frank blind to the missing money. She had actively aided in the destruction of her own home. She had weaponized her blind hope, and it had blown up in her face. The dining room felt like the scene of a fatal collision. The wreckage was everywhere, and the people responsible were finally bleeding out in the open. I locked my phone screen and placed it face down on the table. A final, definitive motion. "We are done operating on faith," I declared, my voice echoing off the walls with absolute, unbreakable authority. "From this exact second forward, there is no more taking someone's word. There are no more blind trusts, no more promises of future deals, and no more secret arrangements. There is only verification." I reached down into my leather work tote, bypassing the neatly organized audit files, and pulled out my silver laptop. The dining room watched in a state of paralyzed dread as I set it squarely next to the half-eaten turkey. I opened the lid. The bright glow of the screen washed over the fine china. I did not bother looking up. I pulled my phone back, opened the keypad, and dialed the toll-free customer service hotline for the National Mortgage Servicer. I tapped the speakerphone icon and set the device perfectly in the center of the table. The dial tone echoed loudly, followed by the sterile, automated greeting of the bank. After navigating the robotic prompts, a live representative came on the line. I provided my father's name, his account number, and my own identifying information as the authorized representative on file. "How can I help you tonight, Ms. Brooks?" the representative asked, her voice cheerful and utterly disconnected from the tragedy unfolding in our dining room. "I need verbal confirmation of the most recent cleared transaction on this account," I requested clearly, making sure the microphone picked up every syllable. "Not a scheduled draft, not a pending transfer. I need the exact date of the last physical payment that successfully cleared the bank." The sound of keyboard clacking filled the room. Everyone stopped breathing. My father gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. "Let me see here," the representative hummed. "All right, the last successful payment applied to the principal and interest was received on the 12th of July. We were currently deep into the freezing autumn months." "Thank you," I said flatly, ending the call before the representative could offer any further assistance. The sharp beep of the disconnected line felt like a gunshot. I turned my attention to the laptop. A missed payment was one thing, but hiding the resulting avalanche of warning letters required a specific, deliberate kind of manipulation. I navigated to the Profile Settings tab on the mortgage dashboard. I clicked on the Contact Information section. "Let us see exactly where the bank has been sending the foreclosure notices," I announced to the room. The screen refreshed. I read the mailing address listed under my father's name. It was not the street address of the house we were sitting in. It was a post office box located in a neighboring county, miles away from my parents' zip code. Frank let out a ragged, strangled gasp. "Who changed my address?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and profound vulnerability. He whipped his head toward my mother. Lydia flinched violently. She shook her head back and forth, her eyes wide with genuine panic. She looked immediately at Sienna. Sienna, however, refused to meet her mother's desperate gaze. Instead, she shifted her eyes entirely toward Derek, her jaw tight, a silent, frantic communication passing between them. The auditor inside me completely took over. A redirected mailing address was never an isolated incident. In corporate fraud investigations, a hijacked communication channel is the absolute loudest red flag for systemic identity theft. If they diverted the mortgage mail, they diverted everything else. I opened a new browser tab and called Frank on speaker. "I'm going to pull your report the right way," I said. "I need your permission, and I need you to stay on the line." He gave it, tired, resigned, but clear. I used the secure credit report portal we'd already set up for him months ago, the one that sends a one-time code directly to his phone. When the code came through, Frank read it out loud. I typed it in. No guessing games, no shortcuts, just the truth, served in black and white. The page loaded. A long, detailed history of my father's financial life appeared on the screen. I scrolled past the auto loan he had paid off 5 years ago. I scrolled past the delinquent mortgage. Then, my finger stopped on the touchpad. 2 entirely new, active trade lines were sitting prominently at the top of the open accounts list. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper, "when exactly did you take out a $25,000 unsecured personal loan?" Frank stared at me blankly, his mouth slightly open. "And," I continued, highlighting the next line with my cursor, "when did you open a Platinum Tier Rewards credit card?" Frank shook his head slowly, as if trying to dislodge a physical weight from his brain. "I have not applied for a credit card in over 15 years, he whispered. "I do not have a personal loan." The fragile, sophisticated facade Derek had been projecting all evening violently shattered. He slammed his open palm against his thigh, a loud, aggressive smack that echoed in the quiet room. His perfectly groomed corporate persona evaporated, replaced by the panicked, cornered aggression of a desperate con artist. "It was just a temporary strategy to build the credit profile," Derek shouted. His voice cracking under the intense pressure, he pointed a frantic finger at the laptop. "You have to leverage available credit limits to scale a business. We were merely utilizing the borrowing power to generate momentum. It is a standard fiscal maneuver." I did not flinch. I clicked directly onto the revolving credit line to expand the detailed transaction history. I read the data, letting the absolute absurdity of his defense hang in the air. "Building a credit profile?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I turned the laptop slightly so the glowing screen faced him directly. "Then perhaps you can explain to the table why this platinum business card currently sits at an 80% utilization rate. Please, Derek, detail how the business is scaling through maxed-out charges for imported mid-century modern furniture, luxury boutique hotel stays in downtown Atlanta, and premium exotic car rentals." Derek's mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish. The corporate buzzwords failed him completely when confronted with itemized receipts. A pathetic, broken sob erupted from the other end of the table. Lydia was weeping again, but this time, the sound was guttural, completely devoid of any previous maternal defense. "I signed things," Lydia confessed, her voice barely audible between heavy, ragged gasps. She looked at Frank, her eyes pleading for a mercy she did not deserve. "Sienna sent me digital document links on my phone. She told me it was just standard sponsorship paperwork. She said the investors needed a guarantor for her new studio lease. She said it was just a formality. I did not read the fine print. I swear to you. Frank, I just clicked the boxes because she said it would help." Frank slumped back in his heavy wooden chair, the fight drained entirely out of his body. He looked at his shaking hands, realizing the full, catastrophic scope of the betrayal. He had not just been lied to about his mortgage. He had not just been scammed out of the cash I had sent. His very identity, his good name, and the credit score he had meticulously built over 40 years of hard labor had been hijacked, strip-mined, and left to rot. Sienna suddenly burst into loud, theatrical tears. She buried her face in her manicured hands, her shoulders shaking violently. But I knew my sister. I knew the cadence of her crying. There was absolutely no remorse in the sound. There was no guilt for the destruction she had caused. She was crying because the luxurious, heavily filtered facade she had built her entire personality around was actively collapsing into a pile of undeniable, documented rubble. She was mourning her own exposure. I closed the laptop screen precisely halfway. The soft click of the hinge cut through the sound of her performative weeping. I looked directly at Sienna, my face completely devoid of any familial warmth or sympathy. "Stop crying," I commanded softly. The absolute coldness in my tone made her breath hitch. "This is no longer a messy family drama about favorite children and hurt feelings. This is a federal criminal file." The word federal hung over the dining room table, a heavy, suffocating weight that finally crushed the last remaining fragments of my father's denial. The color completely drained from Frank's face. The booming, confident patriarch, who had toasted to his youngest daughter's brilliance an hour ago, was entirely gone. In his place sat an aging, terrified man who had just realized his absolute ruin. He placed both of his hands flat on the table and pushed himself up. His chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. He did not yell. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than any shout could have been. "I want the truth," Frank said, his voice grating like crushed stone. He looked directly at Sienna, his eyes completely hollowed out. "I want every single piece of the truth right now, or you pack your boutique bags, you walk out that front door, and you do not ever come back." Sienna recoiled as if she had been physically struck. She looked frantically around the room, searching for an escape route, but there was none. She swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing, and offered a desperate, pathetic half-confession. "We just borrowed it," Sienna stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. It was just a temporary withdrawal. We were just cycling the capital to keep the business afloat. We had a massive contract coming in, and we were going to pay every single dollar back before the bank even noticed the delay. Cycling the capital, I repeated flatly. I did not even bother looking at her. I kept my eyes locked on Derek, watching the beads of sweat form on his forehead. Derek cracked under the sheer, unyielding pressure of the silence. His defensive posture collapsed entirely. He leaned forward, running his trembling hands through his heavily styled hair, and blurted out the missing piece of the puzzle. "We had to," Derek blurted out, his voice a frantic, high-pitched whine. "We got stuck. The cash flow froze because of the lawsuit. If that marketing client had not sued us for a breach of contract, we would have had the liquidity to cover the mortgage and the personal loans." The room went dead silent again. A lawsuit. I did not ask for permission. I reached across the table, grabbed Derek's phone, which was sitting next to his wine glass, and shoved it directly into his chest. "Unlock it," I commanded. "Open your email. Search for the word court." Derek looked at my father's terrifying, frozen expression and numbly complied. His thumb pressed the screen. He opened his inbox, typed the word, and handed the phone back to me like a defeated prisoner surrendering his weapon. I scanned the screen. It took less than 10 seconds to find the exact legal correspondence. I read the cold, hard facts aloud for the room. It was an email from a debt collection attorney. Sienna and Derek had taken a massive upfront retainer from a local business to run a digital marketing campaign, delivered absolutely nothing, and ignored the demands for a refund. The client had sued them. "Default judgment entered," I read, keeping my tone entirely clinical. "A mandatory court appearance scheduled for next Tuesday." They garnished your business accounts, didn't they? That is why you needed so much cash to cover your tracks. You were not building a brand. You were desperately trying to pay off a legal settlement to stay out of jail. And you decided to use my father's house and my father's social security number as your personal bail fund. Lydia let out a loud, agonizing wail. She scrambled out of her chair and rushed to my side of the table. She grabbed my forearm, her fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Please, Bella," Lydia begged, tears streaming down her face, completely ruining her makeup. "She is still young. She made a terrible mistake. But she is just a kid trying to find her way. Please do not make a big deal out of this. It will ruin her life." I looked down at my mother's desperate, grasping hands. I did not pull away. I just stared at her until the sheer coldness in my eyes forced her to slowly let go. "She is 29 years old," I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "I was 21 when I started working 60-hour weeks. I was 31 when I started wiring $2,000 to you every single month. I was also young, Mom, but I did not have the luxury of stealing to fund my mistakes. I was not allowed to fail. I did not have the right to be wrong." Sienna sprang up from her chair, cornered by the undeniable data and stripped of her golden child armor. She resorted to the only weapon she had left. She went straight for the personal attack, her face twisted in pure venomous hatred. "You are miserable!" Sienna screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "You sit there with your spreadsheets and your bank apps, destroying your own family. You are completely alone. Bella, you have no one, and it is because you always have to be right. You care more about being right than you care about us." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply looked at her, entirely unfazed by the emotional shrapnel. "You are absolutely correct," I replied, my voice slicing cleanly through her screaming. "I am right, because being wrong makes people lose their houses." Frank closed his eyes. The fight, the anger, and the decades of enabling his youngest daughter completely drained out of him. He opened his eyes and looked at Sienna. There was no rage left, only a profound, devastating exhaustion. "Get your things," Frank whispered. Sienna froze. "Dad, wait, please." "Get your things," Frank repeated, his voice gaining a hard, undeniable edge. "Take your fancy bags. Take your expensive wine. Get out of my house. Now. There was no physical altercation. There was no dramatic scuffle. There was only the absolute collapse of an incredibly expensive illusion. Derek silently gathered the boutique shopping bags, his head hanging in complete disgrace. Sienna tried to reach out to Lydia one last time, but my mother simply turned her back, weeping into her hands, paralyzed by the destruction she had helped facilitate. The heavy oak front door opened, and then it clicked shut. The sound echoed through the foyer with terrifying finality. I sat alone at the dining table with my parents. The cold pumpkin pie still sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer built on a foundation of lies. It was just the grim reality of the aftermath. Frank slowly turned his head to look at me. He looked 10 years older than he had when I walked in. His shoulders were slumped, his pride completely shattered on the floor. "Can you—" Frank started, his voice cracking horribly. He had to swallow hard to force the words out. "Bella, can you save it this time?" I looked at the federal credit report glowing on my laptop screen. I looked at the massive delinquent balance on the bank portal. I let him wait for the answer. I let him feel the absolute weight of his dependency. "Yes," I finally answered, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I can fix this, but strictly on my terms." My terms were not up for negotiation. I demanded immediate, absolute, and temporary legal control over every single financial asset connected to their names. Over the next 72 hours, I executed a ruthless lockdown protocol. I sat Frank and Lydia down at the kitchen table, their faces pale and submissive, and systematically dismantled their financial autonomy. I froze their credit profiles across all 3 major reporting bureaus. I changed every password to every bank account, every retirement fund, and every utility portal, locking them out of their own lives. I stripped their personal devices of administrative access and enabled 2-factor authentication that routed directly, and only, to my personal cell phone. Finally, I physically collected their birth certificates, their social security cards, and the original deed to the house. I placed the documents inside a heavy metal lockbox and locked it inside the trunk of my car. They watched me do it in complete silence, realizing they had forfeited their right to govern themselves. On Thursday morning, I walked into the downtown office of Arthur Vance, a senior partner specializing in white-collar financial litigation. The heavy oak panels of his office offered a quiet, serious atmosphere. I did not waste his time with emotional family history. I handed him a printed brief of the fraudulent transactions and presented 2 distinct operational paths. Path A was a full criminal escalation. It involved submitting a formal identity theft report to the federal authorities and the postal inspector, an action that would undoubtedly end with my sister in handcuffs. Path B was a heavily structured settlement. It required drafting a legally binding repayment agreement, complete with a confess judgment clause, coupled with a permanent financial injunction barring Sienna and Derek from ever accessing my parents' estate. Arthur reviewed the numbers, raised a single gray eyebrow, and drafted the documents before noon. By Friday afternoon, Sienna had predictably launched a digital counteroffensive. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from mutual acquaintances. She was posting vague, heavily filtered updates on her social media platforms, spinning a desperate narrative about toxic family dynamics and mental health. She accused an unnamed, overly corporate relative of staging a malicious coup, claiming I was swooping in to steal control of the family estate, while she was merely navigating a difficult transitional phase in her career. It was a classic smear campaign designed to manipulate the public optics before the truth got out. I did not type a single angry reply. Engaging with a narcissist online is a losing battle. Instead, I bypassed the public forum entirely and went straight for the infrastructure. I sent a calendar invite for a mandatory video conference to every single aunt, uncle, and elder cousin in the Brooks family tree, if my sister wanted to play to an audience. I was going to provide a captive one. When the grid of faces populated my laptop screen on Saturday evening, the digital tension was palpable. Whispers of Sienna's dramatic social media posts had already poisoned the water. My Aunt Brenda looked at me with clear suspicion, ready to defend the niece she always considered the creative genius of the family. I did not offer pleasantries. I did not give an emotional monologue. I simply shared my screen and displayed a meticulously formatted, one-page document. It was a chronological, undeniable timeline. Column 1 displayed the exact dates and amounts of the $2,000 transfers I had made. Column 2 tracked the corresponding, unauthorized withdrawals bleeding directly into Sienna's failing business accounts. Column 3 showed the active, terrifying default status of the mortgage. Column 4 exposed the unauthorized $25,000 personal loan and the maxed-out Platinum credit card explicitly opened using Frank's stolen Social Security number. The raw, irrefutable data wiped the confusion and suspicion from their faces instantly. Aunt Brenda gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. I was locking the narrative in place with concrete evidence. No one would ever be able to rewrite this history or paint Sienna as the victim again. The stunned silence that followed my presentation was finally broken by my Uncle Robert. He leaned close to his webcam, his face hardening with a sudden, furious realization. He cleared his throat and delivered a piece of intelligence that instantly turned my leverage into a lethal weapon. Derek had visited him privately 6 months prior. Derek had spun the exact same story about a massive, guaranteed angel investment deal closing in 60 days. Based on that lie, Derek had walked away with a $5,000 short-term loan that he conveniently never repaid. 2 other cousins reluctantly unmuted their microphones and chimed in, confirming nearly identical solicitations and missing funds. Derek was not just a failing entrepreneur making bad decisions under pressure. He was running a systematic, serialized affinity fraud through our own bloodline. This was the killing blow. As soon as the call ended, I drafted a final email to Sienna and Derek. I attached the aggressive legal agreement Arthur Vance had prepared. In the body of the email, I added a single, chilling addendum. I informed them about the testimonies from Uncle Robert and the cousins. I stated clearly that if the signed and fully notarized agreement was not in my inbox by 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I would consolidate the sworn statements from every defrauded family member and hand the entire massive dossier over to the state prosecutor as a multi-jurisdictional wire fraud case. They were completely out of runway. The trap had snapped shut. I spent Sunday night preparing the massive cashier's check, drawing from my own emergency savings to take to the bank first thing Monday to officially reinstate the loan. The immediate fire was going to be extinguished. The house would survive. Yet, as I sat alone at the dining room table under the dim glow of a single brass lamp, my mind snagged on a microscopic, nagging detail. I opened my physical ledger and stared at the total sum written at the bottom of the page, $72,000. I looked at that number not as a tragedy, but as a hairline fracture in a much larger, more stable foundation. Sienna was arrogant, deeply entitled, and manipulative, but she was also fundamentally lazy and disorganized, setting up an entirely new post office box, meticulously redirecting federal banking mail, and navigating the complex security protocols to authorize a paperless transition on a decades-old mortgage required a specific, tedious administrative diligence. It required an intimate knowledge of my father's historical data that neither she nor Derek possessed. I traced the edge of the paper with my finger. The money is just a trace. I closed my notebook, letting the absolute silence of the empty house settle around me. The real culprit is usually the one holding the keys. On Monday morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the local bank branch, holding a massive cashier's check drawn directly from my own depleted emergency savings. I slid the thick manila folder across the polished mahogany desk to the branch manager, fully prepared to extinguish the immediate fire and reinstate the loan. But the manager, a stern woman with steel-rimmed glasses, stared at her monitor and frowned deeply. She shook her head, dropping a bureaucratic bomb right in the middle of my rescue mission. The reinstatement request was blocked. A formal, digitized change of payer authorization had been submitted 3 months prior, freezing any manual overrides at the local level without a multi-day corporate review. I demanded to see the source of the authorization. The manager turned her screen slightly. The confirmation email had been dispatched directly from my father's primary personal email account. 20 minutes later, I was back in the house, standing in the kitchen. I threw my laptop onto the granite counter and confronted Frank. He looked genuinely bewildered, his hands shaking as he swore on his life that he had never typed, sent, or authorized any such document. I did not waste time arguing. I pulled up his email provider's security portal and opened the active session logs. The data was irrefutable. The IP address that authorized the bank change mapped perfectly to a premium downtown co-working space. It was the exact same building Derek used to play pretend executive. Sienna and Derek had not just stolen the money. They had actively hijacked my father's digital identity to build the paperless fortress that hid their theft. Yet, before I could even close the laptop, my phone rang. It was the branch manager. She had escalated the block to corporate and managed to clear the hold. But she needed to notify me of a bizarre accounting anomaly. The system showed an odd, fractional payment of $342 that had posted late last week. It was not nearly enough to cure the default, but it was just enough to temporarily stall the automated system from pushing the house into an immediate, irreversible public auction. I frowned. That fractional payment had not come from me. It certainly had not come from my mother, and Sienna's accounts were completely drained. I asked the manager for the routing number attached to the mysterious transfer. I wrote the digits down on a notepad, disconnected the call, and cross-referenced the numbers with the comprehensive credit report I had pulled days ago. It was a dormant, regional community bank account, and it was registered solely in Frank's name. I slowly turned around. I looked at my father. The absolute, terrifying realization must have shown on my face because the remaining color completely vanished from his cheeks. Frank took 2 heavy, unsteady steps backward and collapsed hard into a wooden dining chair. The booming, confident patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered man. The secret he finally confessed had been buried for over 2 decades, long before the adjustable-rate mortgage crisis. Frank had been slapped with a massive civil judgment and a subsequent tax lien from a disastrous, off-the-books business partnership he had hidden from everyone, out of sheer suffocating masculine pride. He had buried the paperwork, but recently, the creditors had tracked him down and threatened severe wage garnishment. Terrified of the humiliation, Frank had secretly reactivated the old community bank account. He had been quietly siphoning fractional, random cash withdrawals from the monthly lifeline I sent, desperately throwing tiny buckets of water on his own hidden fire, before Sienna even got her hands on the rest of the funds. The most devastating part was not the money, it was the silence. When Lydia began noticing the discrepancies and the missing cash, Frank did not confess. Instead, he let my mother blame me. He allowed them to paint me as the difficult, controlling daughter to deflect any scrutiny away from his own financial cowardice. I understood it all in that agonizing moment. Sienna was the identity thief who had looted the vault, but Frank was the architect who had built the dark, silent room where that monster was allowed to grow. On Tuesday evening, I called the final family meeting. Frank, Lydia, Sienna, and Derek sat around the living room like prisoners awaiting sentencing. I did not just hand over the repayment agreements. I laid out a massive, legally binding, irrevocable trust and a durable power of attorney document. I systematically stripped my parents of their financial sovereignty. I forced Frank to look his youngest daughter directly in the eye and apologize out loud to the entire room for his cowardice, for hiding his debts, and for letting my hard-earned money cover his deep shame while he publicly praised the daughter who was robbing him blind. The trust ensured that Lydia could never again secretly fund her favorite child using someone else's blood and sweat. Sienna and Derek signed the notarized repayment contract in complete, defeated silence. The terms were absolute. They were permanently banned from accessing any family financial network. If they missed a single installment, I promised to immediately trigger the federal identity theft dossier I had prepared, sending it straight to the district attorney without a second thought. By Wednesday morning, the massive cashier's check had cleared. The mortgage was officially reinstated, mere hours before the absolute deadline. I packed my overnight bag into the trunk of my car. I did not wait for a tearful hug. I did not linger in the doorway hoping for a miraculous, heartfelt thank you. I started the engine and drove my aging sedan out of Greenville. The highway stretched ahead of me, quiet and open. I looked in the rearview mirror at the fading town line and felt a profound, heavy peace settle over my chest. I do not need to be called the savior. I just need the truth to stand in the right place. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel. Like this video and support us even more by hit the like button so this story can be heard by many more people.